You rise before the sun in the long darkness of a winter morning, and the first thing you notice is how the cold has settled into every corner of the cottage overnight. The embers in the hearth still hold a faint orange glow, so you kneel on the packed earth floor and add a handful of dry straw, then a single split log of birch, arranging them with care. You blow gently across the embers, a soft, steady breath that stirs a tiny flame, and the straw catches with a whisper. A small fire takes hold, pushing back the deep shadows that cling to the walls. The smoke curls upward and finds the hole in the thatch, disappearing into the dark above. You pour water from an earthenware jug into a small iron pot, the jug heavy and cool in your hands, and set the pot on its 3 legs over the growing fire. Into the water you tip a measure of coarse barley from a linen sack, the grains rattling softly, and you add a pinch of grey salt from a wooden salt box kept on the mantel. With a long-handled wooden spoon you give the mixture a slow stir, watching the barley swirl and settle. This will become a thin pottage, the same pottage you have made every morning for as long as you can remember, its gentle warmth spreading through your body after the long, cold night. While the water begins to tremble with the first hint of a simmer, you rise and move to the single shuttered window. You loosen the leather strap that holds the shutter closed and ease it open just a crack, enough to see that the world outside is silent and thick with falling snow. The flakes come down in a steady, unhurried curtain, not driven by any wind, only drifting straight from a pale grey sky that seems to begin just above the roof. You close the shutter again and press the wooden bar into place, sealing the cold out once more. You turn to your stores. In the corner of the cottage, away from the damp, stands a wooden chest made of rough planks, its lid worn smooth by years of opening and closing. You lift the lid and look inside. A half-full sack of barley, a smaller sack of rye, a clay jar of dried peas, another of beans, and a linen bag of dried apples cut into rings the autumn before. You count the items slowly, touching each container as if greeting an old friend, noting that the barley will hold for many more weeks, and the peas still rattle with a healthy sound. You close the chest and check the smaller clay pot beside it, where you keep a lump of hard cheese wrapped in a cloth. The cheese smells sharp and clean. Everything is as it was yesterday, and this knowledge settles in your chest like a warm stone. The pottage begins to bubble, with a low murmur, so you return to the hearth and give it another stir, scraping the bottom to keep the grains from sticking. The steam rises and fills the small room with the scent of cooked grain, a smell that is both plain and comforting, the smell of home. You take a clay bowl from a shelf built into the wattle and daub wall and ladle the pale porridge into it, careful not to spill a single drop, for every grain matters in deep winter. You sit on a 3-legged stool close to the fire, cup the bowl in both hands, and feel the heat seep into your fingers before you lift the first spoonful to your lips. The pottage is thin and slightly gritty, the salt just enough to give it a hint of taste, and you eat slowly, not because you are not hungry, but because the morning stretches long and empty before you, and there is no reason to hurry. Between mouthfuls, you listen to the sound of the fire, a low crackle that never quite repeats itself, and the distant whisper of snow piling against the outer walls. When the bowl is empty, you set it aside and pour a little water from the jug to rinse it, using your fingers to loosen the last grains before tossing the water onto the hearthstones, where it hisses and vanishes. You take your woolen shawl from the peg by the door and wrap it around your shoulders, crossing the ends over your chest and tucking them under your arms. The wool smells of smoke and lanolin, a deep animal scent that you barely notice anymore. You lift the wooden latch of the door, the iron fitting cold against your palm, and pull the door inward against its leather hinges. A puff of fine snow swirls inside and melts on the threshold. You step out and stand in the small, clear space before your cottage, looking at the village under its new white blanket. No footprints mark the snow anywhere, not of man nor beast, and no smoke rises from the cottages that stand empty down the lane, the ones where the sickness came and took everyone in the autumn before the first frost. You do not dwell on this. You simply note the silence and the stillness as facts of the winter landscape, like the bare branches of the old elm at the crossroads. The snow has smoothed every rough edge, rounded every roof, and filled every cart rut with a clean softness that makes the familiar world look like a place from a dream. The air is so cold it stings the inside of your nose, and when you breathe out, a small cloud forms and floats away. You watch the cloud until it disappears, then you turn your attention to the water bucket that stands on a flat stone just beside the door. A thin skin of ice has formed across the top overnight, clear as glass and just as brittle. You press it with your fingertip, and the ice cracks into sharp triangles that you lift out and set aside. Later, when the fire is higher, you will melt them in a pot for washing. You dip a smaller wooden ladle into the bucket and drink a mouthful of the cold water, feeling it trace a chilly path down your throat and settle in your stomach. Then you fill a clay jug for the day and carry it inside, stepping carefully over the threshold so as not to spill. Back inside, you place the jug near the hearth and add another split log to the fire, then sit down again on the stool. The cottage is a single room with walls of wattle and daub, a packed earth floor covered with a scattering of straw, and a roof of thatch that slopes low over your head. A wooden bed platform with a straw mattress and woolen blankets stands against the far wall, and next to it a small table holds a few wooden bowls, spoons, and a single iron knife with a worn handle. Everything has its place, and everything is known. You look at these things not with thought, but with a kind of quiet recognition, the way your eyes move over a landscape you have warped 1,000 times. The fire flickers and the shadows dance on the walls, keeping a rhythm that has no beginning and no end. After a time you rise and walk to the byre door that opens from inside the cottage, a low opening that leads into the small shelter where your 3 sheep stand. You push aside the heavy hide that hangs over the doorway and step into the warm animal smell of hay and wool. The sheep turn their heads toward you, their eyes calm and dark, and you murmur a few soft sounds that are not words, but simply tones of greeting. You fork fresh hay from the pile by the wall into the rack, pulling it apart with your fingers so the stems do not mat together. The sheep nose it gently and begin to pull strands with their soft lips, chewing with a slow sideways motion. You check each animal in turn, running your palm over the thick wool of their backs and flanks, feeling for any dampness or injury. The wool is oily and warm, parting under your fingers, and you find nothing amiss. You clear out the old soiled straw with a wooden rake, piling it in the corner to be spread on the garden when spring comes, and lay down fresh dry bedding from a sack, shaking it loose so it spreads evenly. The sheep make low murmuring sounds, and the smallest one nudges your hand with its warm nose before returning to the hay. You stand with them for a while in the dim, still space, listening to the small sounds of chewing and breathing, before you duck back through the doorway and let the hide fall into place. The morning has passed without your noticing it, as mornings do in winter when the light never truly seems to arrive. You look at the thin band of grey that edges the shutter and know that it is midday, or near enough. You take the woolen cloak that hangs on a peg and lay it across your lap, finding the tear along the hem where a bramble caught it in the autumn while you were gathering hazelnuts. You thread a bone needle with coarse wool thread, the same colour as the cloak, and begin to mend the tear with small, even stitches. The needle pulls through the fabric with a faint, rasping sound, and you draw each stitch snug but not too tight, working your way from one end of the tier to the other. Beside your basket holds raw wool, unwashed and still carrying bits of hay and the scent of the sheep. You set the mending aside from time to time to take up the 2 wooden carding combs. You pull a tuft of wool onto one comb and draw the other across it, back and forth until the fibers lie smooth and aligned, forming a soft flat bat that you roll and set aside for spinning later. The rhythm of carding is as old as the hills that rise beyond the fields, and your hands know the motion without your mind having to direct them. The drop spindle leans against the wall near your stool, a round hole of fired clay at the bottom of a smooth wooden shaft, with a lump of prepared wool wrapped around it, waiting to be twisted into thread. But you are not spinning today, you are only mending and carding, letting the quiet repetitive work fill the hours as the fire burns low and you add another log, then another. Outside the snow continues to fall. You can tell by the soft muffled hush that wraps the cottage, the way every small sound inside seems louder than it should, because the world beyond the walls has gone completely silent. No birds call, no wind stirs the thatch, no distant dog barks. The village is a collection of sleeping shapes under a white coverlet, and you are the only one awake in it, the only one tending a fire and mending a cloak. This thought does not trouble you. It simply is, like the fact that the days are short and the nights are long. You finish the tear in the cloak and tie off the thread with a small knot, then hold the garment up to the firelight to see your work. The mend is nearly invisible, a ridge of new stitches among the old, and the cloak is whole again. You fold the cloak and set it aside, then stretch your arms above your head and feel the pull of muscles that have grown used to resting. You walk to the door and open it again, not because you need to go out, but because the day asks for it, a small acknowledgement of the world outside. The snow has piled up to the height of your ankle on the threshold, and you sweep it away with a birch broom that leans by the door, clearing a small semicircle. The flakes are smaller now, finer, falling more slowly, as if the sky is growing tired. A pale patch of lighter grey shows where the sun might be, low and distant, a reminder that the world still turns. You stand there for a while, the shawl pulled close around your face, and watch the snow fall into the clearing you have made, covering it again little by little. Your breath makes a steady rhythm of white puffs, and you feel the cold on your cheeks and the tips of your ears, a cold that is not painful but is simply present, a boundary between your warm body and the vast frozen air. When you go back inside, you find that the fire has burned down to a bed of glowing coals. You rebuild it carefully, adding kindling first, then a thicker branch, and blowing until the flames catch. You set the pot of pottage from the morning back on the fire to warm for your midday meal, adding a little more water and stirring it slowly. While it heats, you take down the clay jar of dried apples and remove a handful, placing them in a bowl of water to soften. They will make a small sweet addition to your meal, the taste of late summer preserved in wrinkled rings. You eat the warmed pottage standing up this time, leaning against the wall near the fire, spooning it from the pot itself to save washing another bowl. Then you eat the soaked apple rings one by one, their texture soft and their flavor faint but pleasant. When you have finished, you rinse your mouth with a sip of cold water and feel a quiet satisfaction that is too mild to be called happiness, but is something close to it, a sense that the day has been lived as it should be lived, with all the necessary things done. The afternoon light, such as it is, begins to fade almost as soon as it arrived. You light a rushlight from the fire, one of the simple tapers you made earlier in the season by soaking dried rushes in melted mutton tallow. You fix it in its iron holder and place it on the table, where it gives off a small teardrop of flame that barely illuminates a circle around itself, but is enough for you to see your hands and the familiar shapes of your belongings. You sit on the stool and look into the flame for a long time, letting your thoughts drift without catching any of them, watching the way the light dances on the walls and catches the grain of the wood. The cottage settles around you with small creaks and ticks, the sounds of wood contracting in the cold, and the thatch rustles once when a clump of snow slides off the edge and falls with a soft thump outside. Before the light goes entirely, you make one more round of your small domain. You check the byre to see that the sheep are settled, the straw still clean, the hay still in the rack. You check the grain chest and the water jug. You push the shutter tight and make sure the door latch is secure. You add a large log to the fire, one that will burn slowly through the night, and you rake the embers around it so the heat will hold. Then you undress down to your linen shift and slip under the woolen blankets on the bed platform, pulling them up to your chin. The straw mattress rustles beneath you as you find a comfortable position, your body sinking into the familiar hollow that fits your shape. You lie still and listen to the soft crackle of the fire and, beyond it, the deep, absolute silence of the snow-covered world. The cold air touches your face while the blankets hold the warmth of your body, creating a small pocket of comfort in the vast winter night. Your breathing slows, your eyelids grow heavy, and you let the day go without any effort, drifting into a sleep that is as quiet and deep as the snow falling outside, covering everything, smoothing everything, until nothing is left but the steady rhythm of your own heart beating in the dark. The morning light comes later now, a slow grey seepage through the cracks around the shutter rather than a true dawn, and you wake not to brightness, but to a change in the quality of the dark. You lie still under the blankets for a while, listening to the sound of your own breath and the occasional pop of a dying ember in the hearth. The fire has burned low overnight, leaving only a bed of fine white ash with a few glowing hearts still pulsing orange. You push the blankets back and the cold air wraps around you at once, making your skin prickle and your movements quicken. You cross to the hearth in 3 barefoot steps, wincing at the chill of the packed earth, and kneel to coax the fire back to life with a handful of straw and a few dry twigs from the basket. A small flame catches and grows, and you hold your hands over it, turning them slowly, watching the light play on the lines of your palms. The water jug you filled yesterday is nearly empty, just a shallow puddle left at the bottom that you pour into a clay cup and drink in one swallow. You need more water, for drinking, and for the pottage, and for washing your face and hands later. You dress quickly in the dim warmth of the revived fire, pulling on your woolen hose and your second tunic over the first, then wrapping the woolen shawl around your neck and shoulders. Over everything you put on the heavy cloak you mended, its weight settling across your back like a familiar hand. The cloak smells of smoke and old wool, a deep animal smell that has been part of your life for as long as you can recall. Beside the door stands the wooden yoke, a curved length of ash worn smooth by years of use, with 2 short ropes hanging from each end and iron hooks at their tips. You lift it and carry it outside, setting it on the ground while you fetch the 2 wooden buckets from the corner. The buckets are made of oak staves bound with iron hoops, each one holding about 2 gallons, and they knock against each other with a hollow sound as you carry them out. You hook each bucket onto the yoke ropes, making sure the knots are secure, then duck under the yoke and settle it across your shoulders, the smooth wood resting on the padded cloth you have learned to place there. The weight is nothing yet, only the promise of weight to come. The snow has stopped falling overnight, leaving the world covered in a crust that glints faintly under the grey sky. No new flakes drift down. The air is still and heavy with cold that feels almost solid, pressing against your cheeks and making the inside of your nose ache. You stand for a moment at the edge of your cleared threshold, looking out over the village, and your breath makes a series of small clouds that rise and vanish one after another. The path that leads to the well is a shallow depression in the snow, still visible from the many journeys you and others have made over the weeks, though now it is beginning to fill in with drift. No fresh footprints mark it today, and you know you will be the first to walk it. You begin to walk, the yoke balanced on your shoulders, the empty buckets swinging slightly with each step. The snow crunches under your shoes with a sound that is somewhere between a squeak and a whisper, compressing into a firm pad that holds your weight for a moment before giving way. Your pace is slow and deliberate, because there is no reason to hurry and because the cold makes deep breathing an effort. To your left and right the cottages stand under their white roofs, their shutters closed tight, their doors barred. Some of them have no smoke rising from the holes in their thatch, and you know without looking which ones those are: the cottage of the tanner and his wife, the cottage of the old woman who kept bees, the cottage of the young family with 3 small children whose laughter used to carry across the lane in summer. The sickness came for them in the autumn before the first frost, and now their homes are silent lumps under the snow, their thatches sagging a little more each week. You do not stop or stare, you simply note the shapes as you pass, the way a person notes the trees along a familiar road, and you keep walking. The lane bends slightly to the left where the old elm stands, its bare branches black against the grey sky, a few clumps of old man's beard lichen clinging to the bark. From here the path straightens again and leads to the small open space where the well sits at the meeting of 2 lanes, the one you are on and another that leads to the fallow fields. The well is an old structure, its circular wall built of grey stones fitted together without mortar, rising to the height of your waist. A wooden cover, made of 2 heavy planks joined by a crossbar, rests over the opening to keep out animals and snowdrift. Beside the well stands a post with a wooden windlass, and wound around it is a long hemp rope ending in an iron hook that holds the common bucket. A pole of alder wood, its end scraped to a blunt chisel shape, leans against the stone wall, ready for breaking ice. You stop before the well and lower yourself carefully, bending your knees and tilting the yoke so the empty buckets rest on the packed snow at your feet. You unhook them one at a time and set them side by side, their wooden rims dark against the whiteness. Then you straighten up and roll your shoulders once, feeling the relief of the weight that was not yet there. The cold has stiffened the rope on the windlass, and when you touch it, the fibers feel like frozen twine, rough and unyielding. You work it loose with your fingers, flexing the rope back and forth until it softens enough to move freely. Then you lift the wooden cover from the well mouth and set it aside, its underside beaded with frozen condensation that catches the light like tiny pearls. You lean over the stone rim and look down into the darkness, where a faint circle of water glints far below, its surface broken by a thin sheet of ice that covers the whole opening like a pane of frosted glass. The smell that rises from the well is clean and cold, a smell of deep earth and wet stone and ancient water that has never seen the sun. You take the alder pole in both hands and lower it carefully, guiding the chisel end until it rests against the ice. Then you push down with a sharp, firm motion, and the ice cracks with a sound like a dry branch snapping, splitting into jagged pieces that float apart on the dark water beneath. You bring the pole back up and set it against the wall, its end dripping cold beads onto the snow. Now you take the well bucket from its hook and lower it, releasing the windlass handle and letting the rope run through your palms with a controlled friction that warms the skin despite the cold. The bucket descends into the darkness, swaying slightly, and after a moment you hear the hollow knock of wood against water and then the deeper gurgle as it tips and fills. The rope goes slack for a heartbeat, then taut again as the weight of the water pulls against it. You grip the windlass handle and begin to turn it, winding the rope around the wooden drum in slow, even circles that make the mechanism creak with a low wooden groan. The bucket rises by inches, and you can hear the water sloshing inside it, a heavy liquid sound that grows louder as it nears the top. When the bucket reaches the rim, you seize the rope above it and swing it over to rest on the stone edge, water dripping from its sides onto the snow that hisses faintly at the touch. The well bucket is larger than your own, made of the same oak staves but broader, and the water inside it is so cold it seems to glow with its own pale light. You take your first bucket and hold it steady while you tip the well bucket with both hands, pouring a stream of clear water that splashes against the dry wood and swirls around the bottom before settling into a calm, dark pool. You repeat the motion for the second bucket, and now both are full, their surfaces trembling slightly with the movement, reflecting the grey sky in miniature. You dip a cupped hand into one of them and bring the water to your lips, drinking slowly, the cold so sharp it makes your teeth ache for a moment, before it fades into a clean mineral taste that is the taste of the land itself, the chalk and the flint and the deep underground streams. You set the well bucket back on its hook and let it down again so that the next person who comes will find it ready. Then you replace the wooden cover over the well mouth, fitting it into the stone groove with a soft thud that echoes once down into the darkness. The rope you leave coiled neatly on its peg, and the alder pole you lean back in its place. Everything is as it was before you came, except for the 2 buckets of water that now stand at your feet, waiting to be carried home. You crouch and hook the buckets onto the yoke ropes, making sure the hooks are seated firmly in the iron eyes. Then you lift the yoke carefully, using your legs to bear the weight, and settle it onto your shoulders. The full buckets are heavy, each one pressing down with a steady pull that you feel in the muscles of your neck and back, a familiar weight that you have carried so many times your body accepts it without complaint. You adjust the padded cloth under the yoke, shifting it a finger's width to the left, and then you begin the walk back. The return journey is slower because of the load. Your feet sink a little deeper into the snow, and you pay more attention to the ground before you, watching for hidden ruts or stones that might make you stumble. The buckets sway with each step, and you learn again the small movements of your hips and shoulders that keep them from spilling, a subtle dance that your body remembers from years of doing this same thing. A little water does slop over the rim of one bucket, tracing a dark line down the wood and dripping onto the snow where it forms a small hole that immediately begins to freeze. You walk past the old elm with its lichen beard and past the empty cottages with their shutters like closed eyes. You do not look at them directly, but you are aware of their shapes in the corner of your vision, silent and still as stones. The only sounds are the crunch of your shoes, the slosh of the water, and the distant caw of a single crow somewhere beyond the fields, a sound that hangs in the cold air for a long moment before fading. Halfway home you pause to rest, setting the yoke down on a low stone wall that marks the boundary of what used to be the tanner's garden. You roll your shoulders again and stretch your neck from side to side, feeling the muscles loosen. The cold has made the skin of your hands red and rough, and you blow on them to warm them, the breath condensing in a small cloud around your fingers. You look back along the path you have come and see your footprints, 2 lines of them, one going and one returning, already beginning to soften at the edges as the fine snow shifts in the faintest breath of a breeze that has just started to stir. You pick up the yoke again and continue, the bucket swaying, the water murmuring against the wood. When you reach your cottage, you set the yoke down at the threshold and unhook the buckets one at a time, carrying them inside with both hands wrapped around the wooden rims. The warmth of the room, still holding the fire's heat, washes over you, and the contrast makes your cold skin tingle. You pour most of the water into the large clay vessel that stands near the hearth, a tall jar with a narrow neck and a broad belly that holds enough for 2 days of cooking and drinking if you are careful. Some of the water you pour into a smaller pot for washing later, and a final portion goes into the drinking cup on the table. Then you carry the empty buckets back outside, hang them on their hooks under the eaves, and bring the yoke in to lean against the wall. You stand by the fire and hold your hands out, palms toward the flames, turning them slowly back and forth. The heat seeps into your fingers and makes them ache for a few seconds before the ache fades into a deep spreading warmth. The rope marks on your palms, red lines from gripping the windlass, begin to fade as the blood returns. You add a log to the fire and watch the flames wrap around it, licking the rough bark, and then you sit down on the 3-legged stool and let the stillness of the cottage settle around you. The water you fetched now rests in its vessel, a quiet, dark presence in the corner, ready for whatever the day will ask of it. Outside, the thin breeze has died away and the village is silent again, the empty cottages standing under their white blankets, the well covered and waiting, the path marked with your footprints that will last until the next snowfall. You close your eyes for a moment and listen to the fire and the water and the deep quiet of the winter day, and there is nothing more that needs to be done right now. You settle near the hearth with the woolen cloak spread across your lap, its heavy folds draping over your knees and spilling onto the packed earth floor. The fire has burned long enough to produce a steady bed of coals, and the heat they give off is a gentle, constant presence against your left side, warming your shoulder and the side of your face. The cloak is the one you mended partially before, but there are other places now that need attention. A worn patch at the elbow where the weave has grown thin, a small hole near the collar where a moth found its way in during the autumn, and a section of hem that has begun to fray from dragging through wet grass and snow. You run your fingers over each imperfection in turn, feeling the texture change from thick, fulled wool to the loose, open threads of the damaged areas, and you note them without urgency, the way you might note the tasks of a day that stretches long and empty before you. Beside you on the floor sits a small basket made of split willow, its handle broken long ago and never repaired, filled with the tools of mending. You reach into it and take out a bone needle, its surface polished to a soft ivory sheen by years of use, the eye just large enough to accept a strand of coarse wool thread. The needle feels cool and smooth between your fingers, a familiar weight that is almost nothing, and you hold it up to the firelight for a moment to see that the point is still sharp and the eye free of any clogged fiber. Satisfied, you lay the needle on your knee and pull from the basket a hank of wool thread, homespun and slightly uneven in thickness, dyed a deep brown with walnut hulls the autumn before last. The thread has a wiry strength to it, and you pull off a length about as long as your arm, then bite through it with your teeth where the fibers have grown thin. You moisten the end between your lips, twisting it to a fine point, and guide it through the needle's eye with the steady hand of long practice, drawing the thread through until the 2 ends hang equal. The first place you work on is the worn elbow, where the wool has thinned to a gauzy transparency, that would tear clean through under the least strain. You fold the cloak so this area lies flat across your thigh, the outer surface facing up, and you begin to lay new threads across the weak spot. You do not use patches. Instead, you weave new wool into the old fabric, a kind of darning that builds up a fresh surface from the warp and weft that remain. The needle dips down through the cloth and rises again, a finger's width away, pulling the brown thread after it, and you repeat this motion in a slow, steady rhythm that has no need for counting or measuring, only for the attention of your hands and eyes working together. The thread crosses the worn area in close parallel lines, then crosses again in the opposite direction, building a small dense web that blends into the original weave. Every few stitches, you pause to draw the thread snug but not tight, testing the fabric with your thumb to make sure it still has the give of the original cloth. The sound of the needle passing through the wool is a soft shushing barely audible beneath the crackle of the fire, and you fall into the repetition of it, the way you might fall into a slow walk on a long, familiar road. When the elbow is finished, you turn the cloak and examine the moth hole near the collar, a small round gap no bigger than your thumbnail, with clean edges where the threads have been eaten away. You choose a finer needle from the basket, one made of thorn rather than bone, and a strand of thread that matches the cloak's natural grey rather than the brown you used before. You work around the hole in a spiral, catching the loose loops of the original weave and drawing them inward toward the center, closing the gap stitch by stitch until only a tiny puckered scar remains, no wider than a grain of barley. You run your fingertip over the mend and feel the slight ridge of new thread, a texture that will soften with wear until it becomes indistinguishable from the rest of the cloth. Your shoulders have grown a little stiff from leaning forward, so you set the cloak aside for a moment and sit up straight, rolling your head in a slow circle, feeling the small pops along your neck. You add a log to the fire, a thick piece of ash that will burn long and steady, and you watch the flames take hold around its rough bark before you sit down again and lift the cloak back onto your lap. The last task is the fraying hem, a section about the length of your forearm where the edge has begun to unroll and the individual yarns are separating into a fuzzy fringe. You fold the hem under itself, creating a double thickness of fabric, and pin it in place with 3 small thorns you keep in the mending basket for exactly this purpose. Then you begin to sew along the folded edge with a simple running stitch, the needle traveling in and out of the wool in a straight line, each stitch the same length as the one before. The rhythm of this is slower than the darning, more deliberate, because the hem must be strong enough to withstand the drag of snow and mud and the occasional snag of a bramble. You stitch from one end of the frayed section to the other, then back again in the opposite direction to reinforce the seam, and when you tie off the thread with a small knot and bite it free, the hem lies flat and firm, its edge clean and even once more. You set the mended cloak aside, folding it neatly and placing it on the bed platform, where it will wait until you need to go outside again. The fire shifts with a soft, settling sound, and a log cracks, sending up a small shower of sparks that wink out before they reach the height of the mantel. You sit for a while doing nothing at all, your hands resting empty on your lap, your eyes watching the flames without really seeing them. The cottage is quiet except for the fire and the occasional rustle of the sheep in the byre beyond the hide curtain, and the light from the single open shutter has already begun to soften toward the grey of early afternoon. After a time you reach for the basket of raw wool that sits beside the hearth, a deep round basket woven of hazel twigs, filled with the unwashed fleece you sheared from your sheep in the late spring. The wool still carries bits of hay and the faint animal scent of lanolin, a smell that rises when you disturb the fibres, clean and sharp and somehow comforting. You take up the 2 carding combs, flat wooden paddles with handles and rows of fine iron teeth, and you pull a tuft of wool from the basket with your fingers, teasing it apart into a loose, airy cloud that you spread across the teeth of one comb. Then you take the second comb in your other hand and draw it across the first, the teeth passing through the wool with a soft rasping sound, pulling the tangled fibres apart and laying them straight. You repeat this motion many times, back and forth, until the wool on both combs has become a smooth, airy bat, all the fibres aligned in the same direction, and the bits of hay and dirt fallen away onto your lap. You peel the bat from the comb with care, rolling it into a loose tube that you set aside in a growing pile of carded wool on the floor beside you. The pile is soft and light, almost weightless, and it will later be spun into thread for future mending or for making new cloth when the weather warms and you can work at the loom in the long hall. But that is a task for another season, and you are in no hurry to begin it now. You card another tuft and another, the rhythm of the combs as steady as the rhythm of the needle was before. Your hands grow warm with the work, the wool oils softening the dry skin of your knuckles, and your mind drifts into the quiet space that always opens up when your body is occupied with a simple repetitive task. You think of nothing in particular. You notice the way the firelight catches the individual fibers of wool and makes them glow like fine threads of gold. You notice the way the shadows under the stool lengthen and shrink as the flames dance. You notice the distant caw of a crow somewhere beyond the snow-covered fields. These things pass through your awareness without leaving any mark, like water flowing over smooth stones, and you continue to card, tuft after tuft, bat after bat, until the basket of raw wool is noticeably emptier and the pile of carded wool beside you is a soft hill the size of a small loaf. You set the combs down and stretch your fingers, working out the small ache that has settled into the joints from gripping the wooden handles. The drop spindle catches your eye where it leans against the wall, its clay wall resting on the floor and its shaft pointing upward with a lump of prepared wool wrapped around it, half spun, waiting. You pick it up and turn it over in your hands, feeling the familiar balance of it, the weight of the wool pulling the shaft downward. The wool that is already on it has been spun into a fine single strand, grey and even, and you see that there is enough prepared wool left to spin perhaps another arm's length before you will need to card more. You decide to spin a little, not because you need the thread right away, but because the motion of spinning is even more soothing than carding, a slow dance of fingers and spindle that can fill an hour without your noticing. You sit on the stool and hold the spindle in your right hand, the shaft resting against your thigh, while your left hand holds the mass of carded wool. You pinch a few fibers from the mass and join them to the end of the already spun strand, twisting them together with your fingers until they catch. Then you set the spindle spinning with a flick of your wrist, the clay wool turning at the bottom like a heavy top, and as it spins you draw more wool from the mass, pulling it out into a thin ribbon that the twisting motion converts into thread. The spindle descends slowly toward the floor as the thread lengthens, and you watch it turn, the whorl blurring slightly with speed, the shaft revolving in a steady wobble that is somehow graceful. When the spindle nears the floor, you stop drawing, catch the shaft with your free hand, and wind the new thread around the shaft just above the whorl, tucking the end under itself so it will not slip. Then you join a fresh pinch of wool, set the spindle spinning again, and repeat the whole motion, a cycle that has no sharp edges, only a smooth, continuous flow from wool to thread to spindle. You spin for a long while, long enough that the light through the shutter changes from pale grey to a deeper grey that signals the approach of evening. The pile of spun thread on the spindle shaft grows thicker, the whorl now hidden beneath a cone of grey wool, and the mass of carded wool in your hand shrinks until only a small wisp remains. You spin this last wisp out to its very end, let the spindle make its final slow rotations, and then you catch it and wind the last of the thread onto the shaft. You set the spindle back against the wall. It's work done for now, and look at the small heap of finished thread with a quiet satisfaction that is more a feeling of order restored than of accomplishment. The fire has burned down while you were spinning, the log you added earlier now reduced to a long glowing shape that crumbles into sections when you poke it. You rebuild the fire for the evening, adding kindling and a fresh log, blowing gently, and a fresh log, blowing gently, until the flames catch and rise. Then you light a rushlight from the flames and set it in its holder on the table, where its small flame will push back the darkness a little. You pour water from the large clay vessel into a smaller pot and set it over the fire to warm for washing your hands and face, and while it heats you, gather up the scraps of thread and the bits of hay that have fallen from the carding, tossing them into the fire where they flare up briefly and are gone. You fold the mended cloak and place it back on its peg, ready for whenever you next need to step outside into the snow. The mending basket you set back in its corner, the bone needle tucked safely into a fold of cloth so it will not be lost. The cottage settles around you into its nighttime shape, the familiar arrangement of shadows and firelight that you have known since childhood. You wash your hands and face with the warm water, using a scrap of linen cloth to scrub away the day's small accumulations of ash and wool oil, and the warmth of the water on your skin is a small comfort that you appreciate without naming. You eat a piece of hard cheese and a dried apple ring, standing by the fire, chewing slowly, and then you check the sheet one last time, finding them settled and quiet in their straw, their soft breathing the only sound in the byre. You secure the door latch, push the shutter tight, and add a large nightlog to the fire. Then you undress and slide under the blankets on the bed platform, pulling them up to your chin. And you lie still as the fire murmurs and the cold night presses against the walls. The mended cloak hangs on its peg, whole and strong, and the spun thread waits on its spindle, and tomorrow there will be more mending and more spinning and more quiet hours by the hearth. But for now there is only the slow drift into sleep, as gentle and inevitable as the snow that will fall again before dawn. You take the small hand quern from its corner by the grain chest, lifting it with both hands because it is heavier than it looks. The quern is made of two flat circular stones, one resting on top of the other, with a wooden peg set into the center of the bottom stone that passes through a hole in the top stone to hold them in alignment. The lower stone is a thick disc of grey millstone grit, rough to the touch on its grinding surface, but smooth on the outside where countless hands have held it over the years. The upper stone is the same material, slightly smaller, with a carved hollow on top where the grain is fed and a wooden handle fixed upright near the edge so you can turn it. You carry the quern to the open space before the hearth and set it down on a clean linen cloth spread flat on the packed earth floor, the cloth already dusted with a faint layer of old flour that never quite washes out. You kneel on the cloth and settle the quern firmly, rocking it a little to make sure it will not shift while you work. From the grain chest you fetch the linen sack of dried barley, its cloth soft and cool, the grains inside shifting with a dry rustle when you move it. You loosen the drawstring and pour a measure of barley into a wooden cup, filling it level, then carry the cup back to the quern and set it beside you on the cloth. The barley grains are pale brown and plump, each one hard and smooth with a faint seam down its side, and they smell faintly of sun and dry earth even in the middle of winter. You take a pinch of grains between your fingers and roll them around, checking for any dampness or mold that might have crept in during the cold months. But they are as dry and sound as they were when you threshed them in the late summer sun. You pour the first handful of grain into the central hollow of the top stone, the kernels bouncing with a tiny clatter before settling into a shallow pile around the wooden peg. Then you take hold of the wooden handle with your right hand, wrapping your fingers around its smooth, worn surface, and you begin to turn the top stone in a slow, steady circle. The stone resists at first, its full weight pressing down on the bottom stone with a friction that makes your shoulder work to overcome it. But after the first full rotation, the motion grows easier and the stone settles into a rhythm. The sound it makes is low and deep, a grinding hum that you feel in your palms and the soles of your feet as much as you hear it. It is not a harsh scraping, but a continuous rumble, like the distant murmur of a river over stones. The first grains crack between the stones and their broken fragments begin to work their way outward along the shallow grooves carved into the grinding surfaces, pushed by the motion and the weight of the stone above them. You turn the handle in slow circles, one hand always moving, the other resting on your thigh or reaching for more grain. Your body settles into a gentle rocking that matches the rotation, your shoulder and arm moving in a single smooth arc that repeats over and over without hurry. The resistance of the stone changes subtly as the grains break down, growing smoother as the larger pieces become smaller, and you learn to read the feel of the grinding through the handle, knowing by the slight vibration when the grain is fully milled and ready to be swept away. The air around you begins to fill with the scent of fresh barley meal, a warm, nutty smell that rises from the grinding surfaces and spreads through the cottage, mixing with the smoke of the fire and the earthy scent of the wool cloak hanging on its peg. After a minute of turning, you stop and tilt the top stone slightly, using the wooden handle as a lever to lift the edge just enough to peek at the grinding surface. A fine pale flour is already collecting around the outer edges of the stones, spilling onto the cloth in a soft ring. You settle the stone back down and take a goose feather from the small pot where you keep it, its grey barbs soft and flexible, and you sweep the flour gently toward you, gathering it into a small pile on the cloth. Then you scoop the pile into a shallow wooden bowl that you have placed nearby, brushing the last dusting of flour from the cloth with the feather's tip. The flour is still warm from the friction of the stones, and it settles in the bowl like the finest silt, pale brown with tiny flecks of darker bran. You pour another handful of barley into the hollow and begin to turn the handle again, resuming the slow rhythm. This time you notice the way the muscles in your forearm tighten and release with each rotation, the tendons shifting under the skin, and the way your left hand automatically reaches for the grain cup when the hollow is nearly empty. You do not count the rotations or measure the time. You simply turn the stone and add the grain and sweep the flour in a cycle that has no clear beginning or end. The fire crackles softly nearby, and the sheep shuffle in the byre, and the winter light presses faintly against the shutter. And all the while, the quern hums its low song beneath your hands. Every few cycles you pause to sweep the flour again, the goose feather making a soft whisper against the cloth and the stone. You tilt the top stone each time to check that the grinding surfaces are not clogging, and once you find a small hard pebble that must have hidden among the barley grains since the threshing floor, you pick it out with your fingernail and set it aside on the mantel, where it will be thrown outside later. The work is not hard, but it is steady, and after a while you feel a pleasant warmth spreading through your shoulders and down your back, the kind of warmth that comes from slow, persistent movement rather than from the fire. You pause to take off your outer tunic, folding it and laying it on the bed platform, and you continue grinding in just your undershirt, the air of the cottage cool against your arms, but not uncomfortably so. The bowl of flour grows deeper, its surface mounted slightly in the center from all the small scoopfuls you have added. You stop to press the flour down with the back of the wooden spoon, compacting it so you can fit more, and the fine powder leaves a pale print of your knuckles on the spoon's handle. The sack of barley is still more than half full, but you decide you have ground enough for several days of bread, and your arm is beginning to feel a pleasant tiredness that tells you it is time to stop. You turn the quern a few more times to clear the last grains from between the stones, then you lift the top stone carefully and set it aside on the cloth, revealing the bottom stone with its surface coated in a fine layer of meal. You sweep every last particle of flour into the bowl with the goose feather, even the dust that has settled into the carved grooves, and then you wipe the bottom stone clean with a dry cloth, removing the oily residue that grinding leaves behind. You wipe the top stone as well, paying special attention to the central hole and the wooden peg, and then you reassemble the quern and carry it back to its corner, where it will wait until you need it again. The bowl of fresh barley flour sits on the table now, a small mound of potential, and you set about turning it into dough. You take a wooden trough from the shelf, a shallow oval carved from a single piece of alder wood, its surface worn smooth and stained dark from years of use. You pour most of the flour into the trough, reserving a small handful for dusting, and you make a well in the center with your fingers. From the water jug you pour a careful stream into the well, watching the water pool and begin to seep into the surrounding flour, turning it from pale brown to dark. You add a pinch of grey salt from the salt box, crumbling it between your fingers so it scatters evenly, and then you begin to mix with your hand, drawing the flour into the water with a slow circular motion that starts small and grows wider as the dough forms. The dough comes together gradually, the dry flour and the wet water and the grainy salt combining into a shaggy mass that sticks to your fingers and the sides of the trough. You work it patiently, pressing and folding and turning, and after a while the mass begins to grow smooth and elastic, pulling away from the wood and forming a rough ball under your palm. You turn the dough out onto the floured cloth and knead it there with both hands, pushing it away with the heels of your palms and then folding it back over itself, repeating the motion in a slow rhythm that echoes the turning of the quern. The dough gives under your hands and then resists, a living springiness that tells you the grain is good and the water was measured right. You knead until the surface of the dough is smooth and slightly shiny, and when you press it with a finger, the dent springs back slowly. You shape the dough into a neat round ball, tucking the edges under and pinching them closed, and then you place it in a clean wooden bowl and cover it with a damp linen cloth. You set the bowl near the hearth, not too close to the fire, so the heat will not dry it out, but close enough to catch the gentle warmth that will encourage it to rest and soften. Later, when the dough has rested long enough, you will divide it into small flat cakes and bake them on a heated stone placed directly in the embers. But that is a task for later, and you are content to leave it for now. The covered bowl sits quietly by the hearth, its contents invisible and slowly changing, and you feel no need to check on it or hurry its progress. You pour a little water into the trough and scrub it clean with your fingers, loosening the scraps of dough that cling to the wood, then toss the water onto the hearth where it sizzles and evaporates. You wash your hands in the same way, rubbing them together to remove the sticky residue of the flour, and then you dry them on a scrap of cloth that hangs from a peg near the fire. The smell of fresh barley meal still hangs in the air, a wholesome scent that has soaked into the wool of your tunic and the straw on the floor, and you breathe it in without thinking, a smell that means there is food, and there will be more food tomorrow. You sit down on the three-legged stool and let your hands rest on your knees, palms up. The skin of your palms is slightly reddened from the kneading and the grinding, the lines and creases picked out in fine white flour dust that you missed when you washed. You rub your thumb across your palm and watch the dust drift down onto your tunic. The fire burns steadily with the log you added earlier, its flames a soft orange curtain that ripples and folds without sound. Outside the wind has risen a little, a low whisper around the corners of the cottage, but it does not find its way inside, and the room remains still and warm. You look at the covered bowl of dough, at the clean quern in its corner, at the sack of barley still plump with grain, and you feel a quiet order in these things, a completeness that has nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with the simple fact of having done what needed to be done. After a time you rise and move about the cottage, putting things back in their places, the feather back in its pot, the salt box back on the mantel, the grain sack back in the chest with its drawstring pulled tight. You check the sheep through the hide curtain, finding them dozing in their straw, their flanks rising and falling with slow breaths. You step to the door and open it a crack to look at the sky, which has grown darker and heavier with the promise of more snow, and you see that your earlier footprints to the well have been nearly filled in by the drifting wind. You close the door and secure the latch, then return to the stool by the fire. The dough in its bowl will rest for another hour or more before you shape and bake it, and the afternoon stretches out before you with no demands and no urgencies, a long quiet space that you fill with your own stillness, listening to the fire and the wind and the deep silence of the snow beyond the walls. The afternoon has deepened while you sat by the fire, the dough resting under its damp cloth, and you notice now the faint sounds coming from the byre beyond the hide curtain, a soft shuffling of hooves in straw, a low bleat that is not distressed but simply a comment on the passing of the day. You rise from the three-legged stool and stretch your arms above your head, feeling the pull on your ribs and the small release in your shoulders after the grinding and the kneading. You walk the few steps to the low doorway that connects the cottage to the byre, your feet quiet on the packed earth. The hide curtain hangs heavy and still, its surface darkened with years of smoke and the oils from countless hands pushing through. You gather a fold of it aside and step into the small space where your 3 sheep stand in the dimness, their warm breath forming faint clouds in the colder air of the byre. The byre is not large, just wide enough for the animals to stand and turn and lie down, with a low ceiling of rough poles and thatch that slopes down from the shared cottage wall. One corner of it butts against the chimney stack, and a faint warmth seeps through the wattle and daub from the hearth on the other side, enough to keep the space from freezing hard, but not enough to make it truly warm. A small unshuttered opening high in the outer wall lets in a sliver of grey light and a thread of fresh air, and by that light you can see the shapes of the sheep clearly, their thick fleeces, their narrow legs, their dark faces turned toward you with calm curiosity. The smell of the byre is a layered thing, a blend of sweet hay dust and the sharper tang of manure, the oily musk of wool, and the clean, cold scent of the earth floor beneath the straw. It is a smell you've known all your life, and it does not register as good or bad, but simply as the smell of animals and shelter and winter. You let the hide curtain fall close behind you and stand for a moment, letting your eyes adjust to the dimness. The sheep watch you, their horizontal pupils catching the faint light, and the nearest one, the oldest ewe with a dark patch over one eye, takes a step toward you and makes a low rumbling sound deep in her throat. You reach out and run your palm over her forehead, the wool there short and fine, and you feel the hard bone of her skull and the warmth of her skin beneath. She leans into your hand for a moment, then shakes her head lightly and returns to the hay rack, where a few dry stalks still hang from the morning's feeding. The other two, a younger ewe and the wether, remain where they are, their jaws working in a slow sideways rhythm as they chew cud from earlier. You watch the rhythmic bulge move up their throats and back down, a motion as old and steady as the turning of the quern. The hay rack is a simple construction of 3 alder poles lashed together and fixed to the wall at chest height, filled each day from the pile of hay stored in the corner near the outer door. You walk to that pile now, a loose stack of dried meadow grass that you scythed and turned and carted in the long days of July, its color faded from green to a pale gold, but its scent still sweet when you disturb it. You take the wooden fork that leans against the wall, its 2 tines worn to blunt points, and you drive it into the stack, lifting a generous clump of hay that hangs from the tines in a shaggy mass. Some of the hay has been pressed flat by the weight of the stack, and you give the fork a little shake to loosen it. Then you carry it to the rack and push it through the alder poles so that the ends protrude toward the sheep. The oldest ewe steps forward at once and begins to pull strands with her mobile lips, her teeth making small snipping sounds as she bites them free. The younger ewe joins her, nosing a space for herself, and then the wether ambles over, and soon all 3 are standing shoulder to shoulder, their heads dipping and rising as they eat. You take a second forkful and add it to the rack, making sure the hay is spread evenly so each animal can reach. Then you return the fork to its place and brush the loose chaff from your tunic. While the sheep eat, you move among them to check their condition. You begin with the oldest ewe, running your hands over her back and flanks, parting the thick wool with your fingers to check the skin beneath. The fleece is dense and oily, a barrier against the cold, and the skin you find is pink and clean, with no sign of the scab or the little crawling mites that sometimes trouble sheep in winter. You work your way down each leg, feeling the joints for any swelling or heat, and you lift each hoof in turn to check the horn for cracks or rot. The hooves are cool and hard, the clefts clean, and the smell of earth and dung that clings to them is a healthy smell, the smell of an animal that stands in good straw and walks on soft ground. You do the same with the younger ewe, who stands patiently while you examine her, though she flicks her tail once when you touch her flank, a small irritation that passes quickly. The wether is last, and he is the calmest of the 3, standing almost motionless while you run your hands over his broad back and down his thick neck, his ears twitching once, but otherwise still. You find nothing wrong with any of them. No cuts, no lumps, no patches of bare skin where the wool has rubbed away. Their eyes are clear and dark, their noses cool and slightly damp, their breathing even and unhurried. You stand back and look at them as a group, 3 healthy animals eating hay in the dim light, and you feel the same quiet satisfaction you felt when the mend was finished or the flour was swept into the bowl. The straw on the floor needs attention. Over the days it has become packed and soiled in the spots where the sheep stand most often, and a clean bed is one of the small things that keeps them well through the winter. You take the wooden rake that hangs on a peg near the outer door, its handle worn to a smooth polish where your hands grip it, and you begin to scrape the top layer of soiled straw into a pile in the corner. The rake's teeth bite into the matted bedding and pull it free with a dry rustling sound, and you work slowly from one end of the bye to the other, pausing to let the sheep shift out of your way and then settle again. They do not startle. They move with the resigned calm of animals who have known you since they were lambs, stepping aside just enough to let the rake pass and then returning to the hay rack as if nothing had happened. The pile of soiled straw grows in the corner, a dark mound that smells strongly of ammonia and damp earth, and you will later spread it on the garden to break down into the soil, though that is a task for a thaw that is still many weeks away. When the floor is scraped mostly clean, you open the small outer door of the byre, the one that leads directly outside without passing through the cottage. The door is low and narrow, built of vertical planks held together by two crossbars, and it swings outward on leather hinges with a creak that the sheep know well. A gust of cold air swirls in, carrying a few flakes of snow that melt the moment they touch the warm straw, and you step quickly to the pile of fresh straw stored under a rough lean-to just outside. The straw is from the barley harvest, the stems long and golden and still slightly glossy, and you gather a large armful, hugging it to your chest and feeling the hollow stems crackle against each other. You carry it inside and close the door, dropping the armful onto the cleaned floor and spreading it with your hands, shaking it out so the stems lie loosely and evenly. You fetch a second armful, then a third, until the floor is covered in a thick springy layer that rustles under your feet and releases a faint, sweet smell of dried grain. The sheep, still occupied with the hay rack, do not seem to notice the fresh bedding, but later when the hay is gone, they will lie down in it, folding their legs beneath them and settling into the straw with the deep contented sighs that sheep make when they are comfortable. The water bowl in the corner is a shallow clay dish, wide and heavy, so it cannot be tipped, and it is nearly empty now, only a thin skim of ice floating on the last mouthful of water. You carry the bowl outside and chick the ice out with your thumb, the shards tinkling onto the snow. Then you bring it back inside and fill it from the bucket you fetched earlier in the day, the water pouring in a cold clear stream that splashes softly against the clay. You set the bowl back in its corner, and the youngest ewe, having eaten her fill of hay, walks over and lowers her head to drink, her tongue lapping the water with a quick, delicate motion. You watch her drink for a moment, the water level dropping in small increments, and then you turn to the last task. The fleeces need a quick check for any tangles or burrs, because even in winter the wool must be kept in good condition for the shearing that will come with the spring. You take a moment with each sheep, running your fingers through the wool on their backs and sides, teasing apart the few small tangles you find where the fibers have felted together from the pressure of lying down. You do not pull or tug. You work the tangles gently with your fingertips, loosening them strand by strand until the wool lies flat again. The lanolin on your fingers is thick and slightly sticky, and it will make your hands soft when you wash them later. The sheep tolerate this without complaint, the oldest ewe even closing her eyes for a moment as you work on a spot just behind her shoulder where the wool is especially thick. When you have finished with all three, you wipe your hands on a scrap of straw and stand back. The light from the small high opening has grown dimmer, the grey of late afternoon edging toward the deeper grey of early evening. The sheep have finished their hay and are now settling into the fresh straw, folding their legs beneath them one at a time with the careful deliberate movements of animals that do nothing hastily. The oldest ewe circles once, twice, then sinks down with a soft grunt, her head turning to rest along her flank. The younger ewe follows, choosing a spot near the water bowl, and the wether lies down last, his large body making a deeper hollow in the straw. Their breathing slows, and their jaws cease their chewing, and soon all three are still, their fleeces rising and falling in the dimness like three small hills of wool. You stand for a long moment just watching them, listening to the tiny sounds of their rest. A soft sigh, a slight shifting of straw, the occasional liquid gurgle of a stomach working through the hay. The barley is peaceful in a way that is different from the cottage, a living peacefulness that has its own quiet pulse. You duck back through the hide curtain into the warmth of the cottage, letting the heavy hide fall close behind you with a soft slap against the doorframe. The fire is still burning well. The log you added earlier now a bed of glowing coals with a single flame dancing in the center, and the dough in its covered bowl has risen slightly, its surface domed and smooth. You wash your hands in the pot of water that has been warming by the hearth, scrubbing away the lanolin and the straw dust, and you dry them on the cloth that hangs from its peg. Then you sit down on the stool and let the stillness of the cottage settle over you like a familiar blanket, your body tired in a way that is pleasant, your mind empty of anything but the memory of wool under your fingers and the sound of sheep breathing in the dark. Outside, the snow has begun to fall again, a few flakes at first and then more, drifting past the shuttered window without a sound, and you know that the animals are warm and fed and bedded, and that is enough for this day and for many days to come. The fire has been burning all day, fed first with the split birch log at dawn, and then with smaller pieces of ash and hazel throughout the afternoon, and now the stack of firewood beside the hearth has grown low. You can see the bare patch of packed earth where the wood usually stands in a neat pile, only a few thick branches and one half log remaining, enough for the evening and perhaps the morning, but not for the long days after. Gathering firewood is not an urgent task, not a matter of life and death on this particular afternoon, but it is one of the steady rhythms of winter that keeps the cottage warm and the pottage bubbling, and so you decide to do it now, while the light still holds, and the snow has paused in its falling. You take your heaviest woolen shawl and wrap it twice around your neck and shoulders, crossing the ends over your chest and tucking them under your belt so they will not come loose while you walk and bend and lift. Over this you put on the mended cloak, its weight familiar and reassuring, the mend at the elbow barely noticeable now that the wool has settled. You pull on the second pair of woolen hose over the first, the outer pair thick and undyed, and you lace your shoes more tightly than usual, winding the leather thongs twice around your ankles before knotting them. The cold outside is a deep cold today, the kind that seeps through single layers and finds the gaps at wrists and neck, and you have learned through many winters that it is better to spend a little extra time dressing now than to suffer the cold later when your hands are full and you cannot adjust your clothing. Beside the door, hanging from a wooden peg driven into the wattle, is a coil of rope made of hemp, its fibers rough and slightly stiff from age, but still strong. You lift it down and loop it over your shoulder, the coil settling against your hip with a small weight, and you check that the ends are not frayed and that the simple knot you will use to bind the bundle is still tied at one end, ready to be pulled tight. You also take the small hand axe from its place on the mantel, its iron head dark with age, but its edge kept sharp on the whetstone that lies in the corner. You run your thumb lightly along the edge, not to test it but from habit, and you feel the fine burr of sharpened metal. The handle is made of ash wood, smooth and shaped to fit your palm, and you tuck the axe into your belt with the blade facing outward and away from your body, as you were taught to do when you were young and first allowed to carry tools. You open the door and step outside, pulling it closed behind you so the warmth of the cottage will not escape. The snow that fell earlier has stopped, and the sky is a uniform grey, a single cloud stretched from horizon to horizon with no seams or breaks. The air is so still that the smoke from your chimney rises in a perfectly straight column, a grey thread against the grey sky, until it thins and vanishes at a height you cannot guess. The cold presses against your cheeks and makes your eyes water a little at the corners, and you blink the moisture away and draw the shawl a little closer around your face. Your boots sink into the snow with the same soft crunch they made this morning, and you pause to let your body adjust to the cold, breathing slowly through your nose so the air warms a little before it reaches your lungs. The path to the coppice is not a formal path, but a way you know by memory, a line of least resistance that you have walked since childhood. It leads past the fallow fields that lie to the north of the village, their surfaces now smoothed into gentle white undulations that hide the furrows and ridges of the autumn ploughing. You walk along the edge of the first field, where a low stone wall runs half buried under the snow, its capstones poking through like the knuckles of a buried hand. The fields are empty, as they have been since the harvest, and the snow that covers them is unbroken by any track of hare or fox, a blankness that stretches to the distant tree line where the coppice begins. You walk slowly, because the snow is deep in places and because there is no reason to hurry, your breath making a series of small clouds that drift over your shoulder and disappear. As you walk, you notice the small things that the snow has changed since yesterday. A clump of dead grass that yesterday was still visible is now completely buried. A branch of the old hawthorn hedge has bent under the weight of a snowcap and now points toward the ground at a new angle. The tracks you made on your last journey to the coppice have been filled in and softened until they are only faint dimples, barely distinguishable from the natural dips of the land. These small changes interest you without occupying your mind, passing through your awareness like the pages of a familiar book read many times before. You look up once at the sky and see that a few flakes have begun to drift down again, so fine and sparse they seem almost like dust motes rather than true snow. And you pull the cloak a little tighter and keep walking. The coppice is a stand of hazel and ash and a few scattered oaks that have been cut and regrown from the same stumps for generations. A working wood that provides fuel and straight poles for building and the small flexible withies used in wattle. In spring it is full of birdsong and the pale green of new leaves. In summer it is deep and shady, the ground beneath the trees cool and mossy. Now, in the depths of winter, it is a place of bare branches and deep silence, the trees standing like grey skeletons with their limbs etched against the white ground. You enter the coppice at its southern edge, where a gap in the old hedge allows you to pass, and at once the quality of the light changes. Under the trees the grey sky is broken into a lacework of branches, and the snow lies in soft shadow, its surface untouched except for the tiny pockmarks where flakes have fallen from the branches above. The air smells different here, less open, more enclosed, with the scent of cold bark and damp leaf mold and the faint mushroomy smell of the fungus that grows on the old stumps. You stand for a moment just inside the coppice, letting your eyes adjust to the dimmer light and your ears to the deeper silence. Under the trees, sound behaves differently. The few noises from the outside world, the distant caw of a crow or the creak of a branch in the wind, are muffled and softened, and the only clear sound is the small whisper of your own breathing. You begin to walk among the trees, your feet sinking less deeply here where the snow has been partly caught by the canopy, and you look around for fallen wood of the right size and condition. You are not looking for green wood, which smokes and hisses in the fire and gives little heat. You are looking for dead branches that have fallen in the autumn storms and lain on the ground drying ever since, their bark already loosening and their inner wood seasoned to a pale grey. These branches are scattered among the living trees, some half buried in the snow, others resting on top of it where they fell more recently, and you walk slowly from one to the next, bending to examine each piece before you decide to take it or leave it. The first branch you choose is a length of ash, about as thick as your wrist and as long as your arm, its bark peeling in strips to reveal the smooth wood beneath. You lift it from the snow and knock it gently against a tree trunk to shake off the loose bark and any clinging ice, and the sound it makes is a solid thwack that echoes once and fades. You lay this branch on the ground at the edge of a small clearing and continue searching. The next piece is smaller, a hazel branch no thicker than your thumb, but it is perfectly straight and will make good kindling for starting the morning fire. You add it to the pile. Then you find a thicker piece of oak, heavy and dark, a branch that must have come down in a windstorm months ago and has been slowly drying where it fell, half sheltered by the stump of its parent tree. You kneel in the snow to free it from the frozen leaves that have trapped one end, pulling gently until it comes loose with a soft crackle, and you add this to the pile as well. You move through the coppice in a slow wandering pattern, not following any strict order, but letting your eye guide you from one promising shape to the next. The pile at the edge of the clearing grows by degrees, 3 more hazel widths, a forked branch of ash that will need to be split later, a tangle of smaller twigs you gather by the armful and drop onto the heap with a clatter. The cold is a steady presence around you, but the walking and bending and lifting have kept your blood moving, and your hands inside their wool wraps are still warm, though the tips of your ears have begun to ache slightly where the shawl does not quite cover them. You pause from time to straighten up and stretch your back, looking around at the coppice with the slow gaze of someone who knows every tree and stump, and you feel no urgency, no need to rush. The wood is here, and you are here, and the day will last long enough for you to gather what you need. When the pile has grown large enough to make a full bundle, you kneel beside it and uncoil the rope from your shoulder. You lay the rope on the snow in a straight line with a loop tied at one end, and you begin to stack the wood across it, placing the thickest and longest branches at the bottom and the smaller kindling on top, building the pile so it will be balanced when you carry it. You arrange the pieces carefully, turning some to fit, tucking the short twigs into the gaps between the larger branches until the whole pile is a neat, compact bundle about as wide as your shoulders and as high as your knee. Then you pass the free end of the rope through the loop and pull it tight, drawing the bundle together with a firm, steady pressure that makes the branches creak and settle. You tie a simple knot, the same knot you have tied since you were old enough to gather kindling on your own, and you tug once on the rope to make sure it will hold. The bundle is solid and secure, and you can see the line of the rope cutting a shallow groove into the snow where it passed beneath the wood. You stand up and roll your shoulders, loosening the muscles that have tightened from bending over the pile. The snow has started to fall a little more thickly now, the flakes larger and more numerous, drifting down through the bare branches and settling on your shoulders and hair. You brush them away with a swipe of your hand and look around the coppice one last time, checking that you have left nothing behind and that no living tree has been damaged. The clearing where you have been working shows signs of your presence: the disturbed snow, the scattered bits of bark and small twigs too thin to be worth gathering, the faint path of your footprints leading in and out among the trees. These marks will be covered by the falling snow within an hour or two, and by tomorrow the coppice will look as if no one has been here all winter. You take the rope end in both hands and lift the bundle, swinging it up onto your shoulder with a single smooth motion that you have made so many times your body no longer thinks about it. The weight is substantial but not uncomfortable, pressing down through the layers of cloak and shawl, and you adjust the bundle once so that it sits squarely across your back. Then you begin the walk home. The return journey is slower than the walk out because the bundle adds weight and bulk that must be accounted for with each step. You walk along the same path beside the stone wall and past the fallow fields, your footprints from earlier now joined by a second set going in the opposite direction, and you notice that the earlier prints have already begun to blur at the edges as the falling snow fills them in. Your shoulder warms under the pressure of the bundle, a specific heat that spreads down your arm and along your neck, and the rope digs a little into your palm where you grip it, a sensation that is almost but not quite painful, a reminder of the weight you carry. You shift the bundle to your other shoulder halfway home, pausing beside the stone wall to make the change, and you see that the village is visible now as a cluster of dark shapes under their white roofs, with only your chimney showing a thread of smoke against the grey sky. The sight of your cottage, so small and still from this distance, brings no particular emotion, only the quiet recognition of a place that is yours, a shelter that is waiting. When you reach the cottage, you lower the bundle onto the cleared space beside the door, letting it fall with a muffled thump onto the packed snow. You untie the knot and pull the rope free, coiling it loosely and hanging it back on its peg inside the door, and then you begin to carry the wood inside in armloads. You stack it beside the hearth, arranging the thick logs on the bottom and the kindling on top, the same careful order you used in the coppice. The pile that was low and meagre is now full and tall, a solid store of warmth that will keep the fire burning for many days before you need to go out again. The wood is cold from the snow and the air, and as it warms by the hearth it releases small smells of bark and moss and the clean, dry scent of seasoned timber. You brush the loose snow from your cloak and hang it on its peg, unwrap the shawl and drape it over the stool to dry, and then you stand before the fire holding your hands out to the flames, watching the new logs you have just set on the coals begin to hiss and steam as the last of the snow melts from their bark. The fire wraps around them slowly, and soon they catch and burn, and the cottage fills with their warmth. Outside the snow continues to fall, covering your footprints and the coppice and the fields, and you sit on the stool and listen to the fire and the silence, your shoulders still warm from the weight of the wood, your hands slowly losing their cold stiffness, and there is nothing more that needs to be done today. The cottage walls have been speaking to you for days, not in words but in the small draughts that find their way through the cracks where the daub has crumbled, the faint cold threads of air that brush your cheek when you sit near the north wall. You notice them most in the late afternoon, when the fire has warmed the center of the room, but the edges stay cool, and when you hold your palm near the wattle, you can feel the outside air pressing through like a slow, steady breath. It is not a large breach, not a hole that lets in snow or rain, just a scattering of hairline gaps and one deeper hollow where the clay has fallen away entirely, leaving the woven hazel rods bare and visible. These small failures are part of the life of a wattle and daub house. The clay dries and shrinks, the straw within it rots after many seasons, and the wind works its way in with a patience that rivals your own. Mending the wall is one of the steady rhythms of winter, a task that asks for no great skill but only the willingness to mix and press and smooth, and you decide to attend to it now, while the outside light is still strong enough to see by and the clay pit is not yet frozen too hard to dig. You dress for the cold again, pulling on your extra hose and the thick woolen shawl, and you step outside with the empty wooden bucket in one hand and a small spade in the other. The spade is a short-handled tool with an iron blade worn thin from years of digging, its edge curved and polished by the soil. The snow has stopped its falling for now, and the world is still and grey, the sky a single smooth sheet of cloud that gives no hint of where the sun might be. You walk the path that leads past the fallow fields toward the stream, or rather toward the place where the stream runs in summer. Now it is frozen over and silent. Its surface a white depression between the banks, but the clay pit you need is on the slope just above it. A spot where the ground is being dug for generations to make daub and pottery and the simple clay ovens that some of the older cottages still use. The walk takes longer than the journey to the well, because the path is less travelled, and the snow lies deeper here, untrampled by any feet but your own from a previous visit weeks ago. You lift your knees high with each step, breaking through the crust with a soft crunch, and your breath comes a little harder, the cold air sharp in your throat. A few bare alders line the stream bank, their roots gripping the frozen mud, and under their branches the snow is thinner, blown away by the wind that follows the watercourse. You stop at the edge of the clay pit, a shallow hollow in the slope where the dark earth is visible beneath the snow, the top layer of turf and dead grass peeled back long ago. You brush the snow aside with your boot, and then with the spade, clearing a space about the size of a small blanket, and you set the bucket on the cleared ground. The clay is frozen hard at the surface, a crust of grey-brown earth that rings dully when you strike it with the spade. You chop at it with short, firm strokes, not trying to dig deep all at once, but chipping away the frozen layer piece by piece, and soon you have broken through to the softer clay beneath, a darker brown that is still pliable, despite the cold. You scoop out a lump with the spade and turn it over in your hand. It is heavy and smooth, slightly gritty with the fine sand that runs through this seam, and when you press your thumb into it, the dent stays. This clay will mix well with the straw you have saved, making a daub that will dry hard and crack free if you apply it carefully. You fill the bucket with lump after lump, packing the clay down with your knuckles so that it will not fall out on the walk back, and when the bucket is nearly full you scrape the last few pieces from the edges of the hole you have made. The hole is small and neat, and you make a mental note of its shape so that you can find this same spot again when you need more clay in the spring. You brush the snow back over the dug area with your boot, a small habit of tidiness that serves no real purpose but feels right. You carry the bucket back to the cottage, the weight of the clay pulling at your arm and making you lean a little to the side. The walk is slow and steady, and you pause once to change hands, flexing your fingers to bring back the warmth. The bucket's iron handle is cold even through your wool wraps, and you shift your grip to a spot where the metal is less exposed. When you reach the cottage, you set the bucket down on the threshold and push the door open, then carry the clay inside and place it near the hearth to begin softening. The cold clay will not mix properly with the straw and water until it has lost some of its winter chill, and so you leave it there for a while, turning the bucket occasionally so the warmth reaches all sides, while you go about other small tasks, adding a log to the fire, checking the sheep through the hide curtain, drinking a cup of water from the jug. After a time you test the clay with your finger and find that the top layer has softened to a workable paste, though the center is still cool and firm. You wait a little longer, and then you pour the clay out onto a flat board you have placed on the floor, a wide plank of oak that you use for mixing daub and for kneading dough on baking days. The clay lands with a heavy, wet sound, a mound of dark earth that gleams slightly in the firelight. Now you must add the straw. From a sack in the corner, you take a handful of chopped straw, the same golden barley stems you use for the sheep's bedding, but these have been cut into short lengths no longer than your finger. The straw will bind the clay together and keep it from cracking as it dries, its fibers holding the mass like tiny bones. You sprinkle a layer of straw over the clay, then press it in with your palms, folding the clay over itself in a slow kneading motion that is not unlike the kneading of bread dough. The straw resists at first, sticking to your hands and refusing to mix, but gradually the clay envelops it and the two substances become one, a stiff dark paste flecked with pale gold. You add a little water from a small dipper, pouring it in a thin stream while you work, and the clay softens and grows more pliable, its surface becoming smooth and almost glossy. You mix until the daub is uniform in color and texture, with no dry lumps or pockets of bare straw, and then you scoop it back into the bucket, which you carry to the north wall, where the cracks are worst. The north wall is the one that takes the brunt of the winter winds, and it shows its age more than the others. The wattle is made of hazel rods woven horizontally around vertical stakes, a tight basket work that you can see in patches where the daub has fallen away. The largest gap is beside the window, a hollow about the size of your spread hand where the clay has crumbled completely, leaving a dark opening through which you can feel the outside air moving. There are other smaller cracks, a vertical split along one of the stakes where the daub has shrunk, a scattering of pinholes where the clay has eroded grain by grain, and a place near the floor where a mouse worked a small passage last autumn before you blocked it with a stone. You kneel before the wall with the bucket of daub beside you, a bowl of water for smoothing, and a small wooden trowel that you have shaped from a scrap of ash. You begin with the largest gap. You scoop a handful of daub from the bucket, the mixture cool and heavy in your palm, and you press it into the hollow, pushing it firmly against the wattle so that it squishes between the rods and grips them from both sides. You add more daub, building up the patch in layers, pressing each layer into the one beneath, so that there are no voids or air pockets that might later crack. The smell of the wet clay is clean and earthy, a scent of deep soil and old rain, and it mixes with the wood smoke and the wool of your tunic. When the patch is slightly thicker than the surrounding wall, you take the wooden trowel and smooth the surface, drawing the flat edge across the daub in slow, even strokes that leave a faint grain like the grain of cut wood. You dip your fingers in the water bowl and run them over the edges of the patch, blending the new daub into the old plaster so that the join is seamless, and then you sit back and look at your work. The patch is dark and wet against the pale grey of the old wall, but you know that as it dries over the coming days, it will lighten to match its surroundings until it is nearly invisible. The vertical split comes next. It is a crack no wider than a straw stem, running from the height of your chest down to the floor, and you work the daub into it with your thumb, pressing the clay deep into the fissure and then wiping the excess away with the edge of your hand. The crack fills slowly, the clay disappearing into the wall as if it is being drunk, and you add more and more until a thin line of daub stands proud of the surface, which you then smooth flat with the trowel. The pinholes you fill one by one, dabbing a tiny amount of daub onto your fingertip and pressing it into each hole with a gentle twist, a motion that becomes repetitive and almost hypnotic as you work your way across the wall from left to right and then back again, finding holes you missed on the first pass. The cold from the wall seeps into your knees where you kneel on the packed earth, and you shift your position from time to time, moving a folded cloth beneath you for cushioning. The mouse hole near the floor is the last repair. You remove the stone you placed there in the autumn, a smooth river rock that has been doing its duty well, and you peer into the darkness of the gap. It is empty now, no sign of nest or occupant, and you reach in with your fingers to feel the extent of the hollow. It is small, just a tunnel through the daub to the wattle on the other side, and you stuff it with a plug of daub mixed with an extra handful of straw to give it strength. You press the daub in firmly, using a stick to tamp it deep into the hole, and then you smooth the surface inside and out, taking care to blend the patch on the outer side by reaching through the narrow gap between the wattle and the wall. When the hole is filled, you replace the stone anyway, pressing it against the fresh daub to hold it in place while it dries. A small insurance against any creature that might try to come through again before the clay hardens. You clean your hands in the bowl of water, rubbing the clay from your fingers and from under your nails, watching the water turn cloudy and brown. You empty the bowl outside the door, tossing the dirty water onto the snow where it leaves a faint stain that will be covered by the next snowfall. Then you wash your hands again with fresh water from the jug, drying them on the scrap of cloth, and you put the remaining daub back in the bucket and cover it with a damp cloth so it will not dry out before you can use it for any further repairs you might find later. The trowel you wipe clean and set on the mantel to dry. The flat board you used for mixing you carry outside and brush clean with the twig broom, leaning it against the wall where the cold air will finish the job. You stand back from the north wall and examine it. The fresh patches are dark and damp, a constellation of darker shapes against the pale grey plaster, and the air near the wall smells of wet earth and clean clay. You hold your palm up to the place where the draught used to come through, and you feel nothing, only the still air of the cottage and the distant warmth of the fire. The wall is whole again, or as whole as it ever is, and the small satisfaction of this settles into you like the warmth of the pottage in the morning, a quiet bodily sense of order restored. You walk around the cottage, checking the other walls out of habit, and you find a few tiny cracks near the door that you fill with the last of the daub, using your fingertip to work the clay into the gaps. Then you clean your hands one final time and sit down on the stool by the fire. The afternoon has drawn on while you worked, and the light through the shutter has begun its slow fade toward evening. You watch the flames for a while, letting your hands rest on your knees, and you feel the pleasant tiredness that follows a task completed with attention. The walls around you are dark and quiet, their cracks filled, their surfaces smooth, and the cottage seems to hold the warmth of the fire a little more closely than before. You think about the clay pit and the stream and the hazel rods woven behind the daub, and you think about the many hands that have repaired these walls before yours, the generations of people who mixed clay and chopped straw and pressed it into the gaps with the same motions you have just made. The thought is not a thought exactly. It is more like a feeling of connection, a sense that you are doing what has always been done, and it fades as gently as it came, leaving behind only the stillness of the evening and the soft crackle of the fire. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the silence of the walls that no longer whisper with draughts, and you let yourself rest. The light through the shutter has been fading for some time, a slow dimming from the pale grey of afternoon to the deeper grey of early evening, and you can feel the darkness gathering in the corners of the cottage like water pooling in low ground. The fire gives off a warm orange glow that pushes back the shadows immediately around the hearth, but beyond that small circle the room sinks into a soft obscurity, where the shapes of your belongings become suggestions rather than certainties. You know that the long winter evening stretches ahead of you, hours of darkness broken only by the flicker of the flames, and while the fire is enough for warmth, it is not enough for the small tasks of the night, the mending, the carding, the slow eating of a bowl of pottage by something more than the light of embers. You need a rushlight, or better yet several, to carry you through the coming days when the sun seems to abandon the sky almost as soon as it arrives. The materials for making rushlights are simple and few, and you gather them now from their various resting places around the cottage. From a high shelf where the air is dry and safe from mice, you take down a bundle of common rushes that you gathered and dried in the late summer, their stems pale and hollow and as light as straw. You lay the bundle on the floor near the hearth and loosen the twine that holds it together, and the rushes fan out in a pale sheaf, their color the soft tan of dried grass. You select 24 of the straightest and thickest, each one about as long as your forearm, and set them aside in a neat pile. From the corner near the grain chest, you fetch a small iron pot, blackened with use, its interior coated with a layer of old tallow that has hardened to a pale yellow wax. This pot is reserved for rendering fat and making lights, and it smells faintly of mutton, a rich animal scent that is not unpleasant. You set the pot on its 3 stubby legs near the edge of the hearth, where the coals are hot but not flaming. Now you need the tallow itself. In a small stoneware crock with a wooden lid, kept in the coldest corner of the cottage so it will not go rancid, is the saved fat from the autumn slaughter. You lift the lid and look inside. The mutton tallow has been rendered once already, strained through a cloth to remove the bits of membrane and meat, and it has cooled into a solid mass the color of pale butter. Its surface smooth and slightly concave where it shrank as it set. You scoop out a portion with a wooden spoon, about the size of a small fist, and transfer it to the iron pot. The tallow is firm and cool, and it cleaves cleanly from the spoon, landing in the pot with a soft thud. You set the crock aside and push the iron pot a little closer to the coals, using a folded cloth to protect your hand from the heat. The tallow begins to soften almost at once, its edges turning translucent and then liquid, and a thin clear pool spreads across the bottom of the pot while the rest of the mass slowly sinks and melts. You watch the transformation with the patient attention of someone who has done this many times, noting the small bubbles that rise as the fat releases the last of its trapped moisture, the way the melting tallow gives off a clean warm smell that mingles with the wood smoke and the dry scent of the rushes. While the tallow melts, you prepare the rushes. Each stem is a single hollow tube with a pithy core that will soak up the liquid fat like a wick. You take a small sharp knife and trim the thin end of each rush, cutting away the last inch where the stem tapers to a point, leaving a clean blunt tip. You also strip away any remaining leaf sheaths, the papery brown remnants that cling to the lower part of the stem, pulling them off with a gentle tug that leaves the smooth, pale surface bare. The pile of prepared rushes grows beside you, each one identical to the last in thickness and length, a uniformity that pleases some quiet part of your mind without your having to think about it. You also prepare a flat stone, a piece of slate that you keep for this purpose, wiping it clean with a damp cloth and setting it on the hearth away from the direct heat of the coals. This stone will serve as a cooling surface where the dipped rushes can lie and harden without sticking. The tallow has melted completely now, a clear golden liquid that trembles slightly with the heat, its surface reflecting the firelight in a small bright disk. You test the temperature not with a thermometer, which is a thing you have never seen and cannot imagine, but by holding your palm a few inches above the surface, feeling the warmth that rises, and by watching the way the liquid moves when you tilt the pot slightly. It should be fully liquid but not so hot that it smokes or gives off a harsh smell. You judge it to be right, a gentle liquid heat that will penetrate the rush pith without scorching it. You move the pot to a slightly cooler spot at the edge of the hearth, where the tallow will stay melted but will not grow hotter, and you arrange your materials around you in a small semicircle, the pile of trimmed rushes on your left, the pot of tallow in front of you, the slate cooling stone on your right, and a scrap of old linen cloth for wiping your fingers. You take the first rush between your thumb and forefinger, holding it near the base, and you lower it slowly into the melted tallow. The liquid fat accepts the stem without resistance, and you feel the slight change in weight as the pith inside begins to drink. You hold the rush submerged, watching the tiny bubbles rise from the hollow core, counting silently to yourself, not because the number matters, but because the rhythm of counting is part of the process. After a slow count of 20, you lift the rush out, and the excess tallow drips from the tip in heavy golden drops that fall back into the pot with a soft plink. The rush is transformed. Its pale surface has become a deeper gold, almost amber, slick and gleaming, and it steams a little in the cooler air. You hold it above the pot for a few moments longer, letting the last drops fall, and then you carry it carefully to the slate stone and lay it down in a straight line. The tallow on the stone around it immediately begins to cool and set, forming a faint waxy halo. You take the second rush and repeat the process, lowering, holding, counting, lifting, dripping, laying. The motions are the same but not identical, because each rush has its own slight curve, its own tiny variations in thickness, and your hand adjusts to these differences without your having to think about them. The third rush you hold a little longer in the tallow because it is slightly thicker, and you want the pith to be fully saturated. The fourth rush you lift more quickly because you have learned from the third that the tallow is still hot enough to penetrate well. A rhythm establishes itself, a cycle that has no sharp edges. Dip and hold and lift and lay, dip and hold and lift and lay. your right hand moving between the pot and the stone while your left hand reaches for the next rush. The smell of warm tallow fills the space around you, a smell that is rich and slightly sweet and deeply familiar, the smell of winter evenings and small flames and the slow, patient work that keeps the darkness at bay. The pile of dipped rushes on the slate stone grows longer, each one lying parallel to its neighbors with small gaps between them so they will not stick together as they cool. The first ones you dipped are already beginning to harden, their surfaces turning from wet gloss to a soft matte finish, and you can see the tallow crystallizing into a fine grain that catches the firelight. You reach for the next rush and find that the pile of untrimmed stems is empty. You have dipped them all. You count the rushes on the stone, touching each one with your fingertip as you go, and you find that you have made 16 rushlights, enough to light the evenings for a week or more if you are sparing with them. You pick up one of the first rushes, now fully cooled and firm, and you roll it between your fingers to feel the texture. The tallow has soaked through the pith completely, making the stem heavier than it was and slightly flexible rather than brittle, and its surface is smooth and only faintly greasy. When you hold it to your nose, you smell the clean animal scent of the mutton fat, nothing more. You set aside 10 of the best rushlights, the straightest and most evenly coated, to store for later use. These you bundle together with a strip of linen, tying it loosely so the rushes will not rub against each other and lose their tallow coating. You place the bundle on the high shelf where they will stay cool and dry, protected from any nibbling creatures. The remaining 6 you will use over the next few days, and you arrange them in a small clay cup that you keep on the mantel for exactly this purpose, their tips pointing upward like a bouquet of pale stems. Before you clean up, you decide to light one of the new rushlights to test its quality. You take a simple iron holder from the mantel, a flat base with a vertical socket and a small cup to catch drips, and you slide the thin end of a rush into the socket, the fit snug enough to hold it upright. You hold the thicker end, which will serve as the wick, to the fire, touching it to the edge of a flame. The tallow catches at once, melting and feeding a small flame that trembles for a moment before steadying into a teardrop of light. The flame is not large, no brighter than a single candle, but it pushes back the shadows in a small circle around itself and casts a warm yellow glow on the wall behind it. You set the holder on the table and watch the flame for a moment, noting its steadiness and the clean way it burns with almost no smoke. The rushlight will last perhaps an hour, maybe a little more, and then you will need to light another, but for now it is enough. You turn back to the pot of tallow on the hearth. The liquid fat has begun to cool now that it has been moved away from the heat, and a thin skin is forming on its surface, a pale membrane that wrinkles when you touch it with the spoon. You pour the remaining liquid tallow back into the stoneware crock, tilting the pot slowly so that the stream is steady and does not splash. A few drips run down the outside of the pot, and you catch them with the scrap of linen, wiping the iron clean. The crock you seal with its wooden lid and return to its cold corner, where the tallow will solidify again, and wait for the next batch of rushlights. The iron pot you scrub with a handful of dry straw to remove the last greasy residue, then wipe with the cloth, and you set it back on its shelf. The slate stone you carry outside for a moment, tilting it against the cottage wall where the cold air will freeze any remaining tallow, so that you can scrape it off in the morning, a small task for another day. You wash your hands in the bowl of water you keep near the hearth, rubbing them together to remove the greasy feel of the tallow, and then you dry them on the cloth that hangs from its peg. The cottage is quiet, except for the soft crackle of the fire and the faint hiss of the burning rushlight, a sound so small you might miss it if you were not listening. The flame of the rushlight dances slightly, stirred by the small movements of air that you create as you move about the room, and its light falls on the familiar shapes of your world, the grain chest, the mending basket, the wool cloak on its peg, the spindle leaning against the wall. Everything looks softer in this light, the hard edges rounded, the shadows deeper and warmer. You sit down on the three-legged stool and let your hands rest on your knees, palms up. The evening stretches before you, a long quiet space that you will fill with small tasks, or with stillness, whichever seems right. You think about the tallow and the rushes and the small flame that burns so steadily on the table, and you think about the many evenings you have spent in this same cottage, doing these same things, season after season. The thought does not carry any weight of sadness or joy. It simply is a recognition of continuity, of the way the days repeat themselves without ever being exactly the same. The rushlight burns lower, its flame growing slightly longer as the tallow in the pith is consumed, and you watch it without expectation, letting your mind drift into the same quiet space it enters when you card wool or turn the quern. Outside, the snow may be falling again, or it may not. The wind may be rising, or the world may be perfectly still. Inside the cottage, there is only the fire, the small light, and the deep abiding peace of a winter evening that asks nothing of you but your presence. The rushlight has burned down to a stub, its flame grown thin and blue at the base, and you pinch it out between your thumb and forefinger before it can gutter and smoke. The cottage settles into the deeper darkness of true night, lit only by the fire, and you feel the first small emptiness in your stomach that tells you it is time to prepare a proper meal. The pottage you ate this morning was thin and quickly gone, and the dried apple rings were a small sweetness that did little to fill you. Now your body asks for something more substantial, a stew that will warm you from the inside and yield enough to feed you for several days without the need to cook again each evening. You rise from the stool and move about the cottage with the sure steps of someone who knows every span of the floor. From the grain chest, you take a clay jar of dried peas, its lid sealed with a piece of oiled cloth, tied down with twine. You loosen the twine and lift the cloth, and the smell that rises is dry and faintly sweet. The smell of peas that have been dried slowly in the summer sun and stored with a few leaves of dried mint to keep the weevils away. You pour a generous handful of peas into a wooden bowl, then a second handful for good measure, and you carry the bowl to the small table where the light of the fire falls strongest. You sit on the stool and begin to sort through the peas, pushing them around with your fingertip and picking out the few that are dark or shriveled or have a tiny hole where a worm has found its way in. These you toss into the fire, where they sizzle for a moment and vanish. The good peas you leave in the bowl, pale green and smooth, each one a small hard sphere that rattles when you shake the bowl gently. When you have sorted enough, you pour fresh water from the jug over the peas until they are covered by the depth of 2 fingers, and you set the bowl aside on the table to soak. The peas will soften over the next hour while you prepare the other ingredients, and when the time comes to cook them, they will break down into a thick, creamy broth. Now, you turn to the salted pork. In a small wooden box, lined with a scrap of old linen, kept in the coldest corner of the cottage near the door, is the meat you preserved in the autumn. You lift the lid and the smell of salt and smoke and cured meat rises to meet you, a deep savory scent that makes your stomach tighten with a hunger that is more anticipation than need. The piece you choose is about the size of your fist, a cut from the shoulder with streaks of pale fat running through the dark meat. It has been packed in coarse salt and then hung in the smoke of the hearth for days, and its surface is dry and firm and dark brown, almost black in places. You carry it to the table and set it on a clean board, then take up your iron knife. The blade is sharp, and you begin to cut the pork into small cubes, each one no larger than a thumbnail. The meat is dense and offers a pleasant resistance to the knife, and the fat within it is firm and white, slicing cleanly. You work slowly, making the cubes as even as you can, and when you are finished you have a small pile of diced pork that fills a wooden cup. You sweep the last few scraps into your palm and drop them into the cup. Then you wipe the knife clean and set it aside. The onion comes from a net of onions that hangs from a rafter near the door, their papery skins rustling when you touch them. You select one that is still firm, though it has shrunk a little over the months, and its outer skin is dry and crackling. You peel away the papery layers, revealing the paler flesh beneath, and you cut off the root end and the dry top with a single stroke of the knife. The onion is smaller than it was in autumn, but it still holds its sharp scent, and when you slice into it, the juice rises and makes your eyes sting just a little at the corners. You blink the moisture away and continue cutting, reducing the onion to a heap of fine dice that you scoop up and set beside the pork. The knife leaves a faint onion smell on your fingers, a sharp, clean scent that will linger for hours. From the same corner, tucked into a basket of sand that keeps them from shriveling too quickly, you take a single carrot. It is a little soft now, its skin slightly wrinkled, but when you cut into it with the knife, the flesh inside is still orange and firm and smells of the earth it grew in. You peel away the outer layer with the blade, letting the thin strips fall onto the table, and then you slice the carrot into thin rounds, each one about as thick as a coin. You cut the larger rounds in half so that all the pieces will cook evenly, and you add them to the growing collection of ingredients on the table. A small clay pot on the mantel holds the dried herbs you gathered in the summer and hung in bunches from the rafters until they were crisp and ready. You lift the lid, and the scent of wild thyme rises, a fragrance that is both sharp and sweet. The smell of the hot afternoons when you walked the meadow edges, picking the tiny leaves from the wiry stems. You take a pinch of the dry thyme between your thumb and forefinger and crumble it into the palm of your other hand, the leaves breaking into small fragments that release their oils and stain your skin with a faint green smell. A second pinch of dried sage, its leaves broader and softer, goes into your palm as well, and then you tip the herbs into a small wooden dish where they wait, a tiny heap of grey-green flecks. The fire has burned down to a good bed of coals while you have been preparing the ingredients, and you now set about building it up for the long, slow cooking that lies ahead. You add 2 thick logs of ash, placing them side by side so that they will catch and burn steadily, and you wait until the flames wrap around them and the new wood begins to crackle. Then you take your largest cooking pot, a heavy iron vessel with 3 stubby legs and a bowed belly, blackened on the outside from many years of use. You set it on its legs directly over the hottest part of the coals, and you let it warm for a few moments while you gather the ingredients close at hand. When the pot is warm enough that a drop of water flicked from your fingers sizzles and dances on its surface, you add the diced pork. The meat hits the hot iron with a sharp hiss, and the fat begins to render at once, melting and pooling around the small cubes. You stir the pork with a long-handled wooden spoon, pushing the pieces around so that they brown on all sides, and the smell that rises is rich and savory, the smell of roasting meat and sizzling fat that fills the cottage and makes your mouth water. The pork cubes shrink a little as their fat renders out, turning from dark brown to a lighter shade with crispy edges, and when they are nicely browned, you lift them out with the spoon and set them aside in a bowl, leaving the rendered fat in the pot. Into the hot fat you add the diced onion, and the sound it makes is a gentler sizzle, a soft hissing that is almost a whisper. You stir the onion slowly, watching it turn translucent as it cooks, its sharp edges softening, its color shifting from white to pale gold. The smell of cooking onion mingles with the smell of the pork fat, a combination that is one of the most familiar and comforting smells you know, the smell of food being made with care. When the onion is soft and golden, you add the carrot rounds and stir them in, letting them cook for just a minute or two until their edges begin to soften and their color deepens. Now you return the pork to the pot, tipping the bowl and scraping every last cube into the mixture, and you stir everything together so that the meat and the vegetables are evenly distributed. You pour in water from the jug, enough to cover everything by the depth of your hand, and then you add the dried herbs, scattering them across the surface where they float for a moment before the stirring spoon draws them down into the liquid. A pinch of grey salt from the salt box goes in next, crumbles between your fingers so it dissolves quickly, and then you add the soaked peas, draining them first through a cloth so that the soaking water, which can be bitter, is discarded. The peas tumble into the pot with a soft plop, pale and swollen from their soaking, and you stir them in gently so they do not break apart before their time. The pot now holds everything it needs, the meat and the fat, the onion and the carrot, the peas and the herbs and the salt, all suspended in the clear water that is already beginning to warm and tremble with the first hints of a simmer. You adjust the pot on its legs, moving it slightly to one side of the coals so that it will not boil too hard, for a stew should only murmur, a low, steady sound that continues for hours without a tension. Then you sit back on the stool and let the fire do its work. The water takes a long time to come to a proper simmer, because the pot is large and full and the fire is gentle rather than fierce. You watch the surface of the liquid, waiting for the first small bubbles to rise, and after a time they appear, a few at first near the edges of the pot where the iron is hottest, then more and more until the whole surface is trembling with a gentle motion that sends soft ripples toward the rim. The bubbles rise and break with tiny popping sounds, and the steam begins to rise in a steady column, carrying the smells of the stew with it. The scent fills the cottage slowly, layer upon layer. First the clean, sharp smell of the thyme and sage, then the deeper savory smell of the pork, then the earthy sweetness of the carrot and onion, and under it all, the faint mineral smell of the well water and the iron pot. It is the smell of patience, of slow transformation, of ingredients that are giving themselves to each other in the quiet heat. You stir the stew from time to time, lifting the wooden spoon from its resting place across the rim of the pot and drawing it slowly through the liquid, scraping the bottom gently to make sure nothing is sticking. Each time you stir, the stew has changed a little, the peas have softened further, beginning to lose their shape, the carrot rounds are tender enough to cut with the edge of the spoon, and the pork cubes have become yielding and soft, their fibers separating. The broth has thickened too, the starch from the peas and the gelatin from the pork combining to make a liquid that is no longer clear, but rich and slightly cloudy, with a golden sheen of fat floating on the surface in small gleaming eyes. You taste the broth from the tip of the spoon, blowing on it first to cool it, and it is good. The salt just right, and the herbs present, but not overpowering. You add a little more water, because the stew will cook for a long time yet, and you do not want it to become too thick, or to scorch on the bottom. The afternoon has passed without your noticing it, the grey light beyond the shutter giving way to the deeper grey of early evening, and the rushlight you lit earlier has burned down to a second stub that you replace with a fresh one from the clay cup on the mantel. The fire crackles and the stew murmurs, and the cottage is filled with a warmth that is not only the warmth of the hearth, but the warmth of something cooking, something that is being made with attention and care. You sit on the stool and let yourself feel the pleasant tiredness that comes from standing and chopping and stirring, a tiredness that is earned and satisfying. Your stomach makes a small sound of hunger, and you realize that you have eaten very little today, only the thin pottage in the morning and the dried apple rings at midday. The smell of the stew has been filling your senses for hours, and now your body is ready for it. You ladle a small portion of the stew into a wooden bowl, choosing a piece of pork and several carrot rounds and a good amount of the thickened broth. You carry the bowl to the table and sit down, the bowl warm in your hands, and you raise the first spoonful to your lips and blow on it gently, watching the steam curl away. The taste is deep and rich, the pork salty and tender, the carrots soft and sweet, the peas dissolved into a creamy thickness that coats your tongue, and the herbs a faint, bright note at the back of each mouthful. You eat slowly because there is no reason to hurry and because the stew is too hot to eat quickly, and between spoonfuls you look around the cottage at the fire and the rushlight and the mended cloak on its peg, and you feel a quiet contentment that is as warm as the stew itself. When the bowl is empty, you set it aside and consider whether to eat more, and you decide to wait, because the stew will keep, and there will be tomorrow and the day after to finish it. You move the pot to the edge of the hearth where it will stay warm but not cook further, and you cover it with a wooden lid to keep out any ash or dust. You wash your bowl and spoon in a little water and set them on the table to dry, and then you add a night log to the fire and secure the door latch and push the shutter tight. The stew sits quietly on the hearth, its surface now still, a dark mirror that reflects the firelight, and the cottage settles around you into the deep silence of the winter night. A silence that is full of small sounds, the settling of the logs, the rustle of the straw, the distant murmur of the wind. You undress and slide under the blankets on the bed platform, your stomach full and warm, and you close your eyes and let the smell of the stew and the warmth of the fire carry you gently into sleep. A day of complete rest settles over the cottage, like the snow that has been falling in the night, a quiet that asks nothing of you and expects no movement. You wake not to the need for fire or water or food, but to the simple fact of the morning. A grey light at the shutter that is neither early nor late, and you lie still under the blankets for a long while. Your breath slow and even, your body heavy with the pleasant weight of sleep that has been deep and unbroken. The fire has burned down to a bed of white ash with a few coals still glowing beneath, and the air in the cottage is cool, but not cold, the walls holding the last warmth of yesterday's flames. You turn onto your side and pull the blankets up to your ear, feeling the rough wool against your cheek, and you let your eyes close again, not because you need more sleep, but because there is nowhere you must be and nothing you must do. When you finally rise, it is without hurry. You swing your legs over the edge of the bed platform and sit there for a moment, your feet resting on the packed earth floor, your hands loose in your lap. You look around the cottage with the slow gaze of someone who has seen these same walls and these same belongings every morning for years, and you note the small things that have changed. The rushlight holder on the table is empty now, its last occupant burned away to nothing. The bowl of stew from last night sits covered on the hearth, its lid slightly askew. The spindle has fallen from its leaning place against the wall and lies on its side on the floor. These small changes do not trouble you. They are simply the evidence of a life being lived, the small disorder that creeps in when one is busy with other things. You will set them right in time, or you will not, and either way the day will pass. You cross to the hearth and kneel to rebuild the fire, not because the cold is urgent, but because the flames are company of a kind, a living presence that fills the silence with its small sounds. You rake aside the ash with a stick and find a few coals still holding their heat, and you feed them with straw and twigs and a single split log, blowing gently until the fire catches and grows. The flames rise, and the cottage brightens, and you hold your hands out to the warmth, turning them slowly, watching the way the light plays on the lines and creases of your palms. Then you pour water from the jug into a small pot and set it over the fire to warm for washing, and while you wait, you walk to the door and open it a crack to look outside. The snow has stopped falling, and a pale winter sun, the first you have seen in many days, is trying to break through the clouds. It does not succeed entirely, but the light that reaches the ground is brighter than it has been, a thin silver-white light that makes the snow gleam and sparkle. The crust that formed overnight has hardened into a smooth surface that looks almost like glazed pottery, unbroken by any footprint or animal track. The air is so still that the smoke from your chimney rises in a perfectly straight column, and the silence is so deep that you can hear the far-off creak of a branch somewhere in the coppice, a sound that travels across the frozen fields like a message spoken in a language you almost understand. You stand in the doorway for a while, letting the cold air freshen your face and the light fill your eyes, and then you close the door and return to the fire. The water in the small pot is warm now, steam rising from its surface in thin curls. You pour a little into a clay bowl and wash your face and hands, the warmth of the water a small comfort against your skin. You dry yourself with a linen cloth and then dress fully, pulling on your hose and your 2 tunics and your woolen shawl, and you feel the familiar weight of the clothes settling around you like a second shelter. The cottage is warming now, the fire burning steadily, and you decide that today will be a day of small things only, a day of rest and counting, and the quiet pleasure of knowing that the stores are holding, and the animals are well, and the winter is slowly, invisibly, beginning its long turn towards spring. You begin with the stores because it is good to know what you have and what you might need in the weeks ahead. You open the grain chest and look inside, and you see that the sack of barley is still more than half full, enough for many weeks of pottage and flatbread if you are careful. The rye sack is smaller, but still holds enough for a few loaves, and you make a mental note to grind some rye flour in the coming days to mix with the barley. The clay jar of dried peas is half full as well, and the jar of beans beside it is nearly untouched, its contents rattling with a healthy sound when you shake it gently. The dried apples in their linen bag are holding out well, the rings still pale and fragrant, and you count them loosely as you sift through the bag with your fingers, perhaps 3 dozen, more than enough to last until the first fresh greens appear in the spring. The hard cheese in its clay pot has grown a little harder, its surface cracked, but when you pare away the outer layer with your knife, the cheese beneath is still firm and sharp and good. You set everything back in its place and close the chest, and the knowledge of these things, the simple arithmetic of sufficiency, settles into you like the warmth of the pottage on a cold morning. You check the firewood stack beside the hearth and find it still high and full, the logs you gathered in the coppice now seasoned and dry. The pile of kindling is a little low, so you take a few moments to split some thin sticks from a larger branch using the hand axe, working slowly and carefully, the blade biting into the wood with a crisp sound. You add the new kindling to the basket and sweep up the chips and bark that have scattered on the floor, tossing them into the fire where they flare up briefly and are gone. The sheep are quiet in the byre, and when you push through the hide curtain to check on them, you find all three lying in the fresh straw you spread yesterday, their legs folded beneath them and their heads resting along their flanks. They raise their heads when you enter, their dark eyes calm and unworried, and the oldest ewe makes a low sound in her throat that is more a greeting than a request. You fork fresh hay into the rack, though there is still some left from yesterday, and you check the water bowl and find it still half full, the surface unfrozen because the warmth from the cottage seeps through the shared wall and keeps the byre just above the freezing point. You stand with the sheep for a while, listening to their slow breathing and the soft sounds of their digestion, and you feel the same quiet peace you always feel in their presence, a peace that comes from being near creatures who ask for nothing but hay and water and a clean place to rest. Back in the cottage, you take down the mending basket and examine the cloak and the tunics and the hose for any new tears or worn spots. You find none that need immediate attention, only a small loose thread on the cuff of one tunic that you snip off with your knife, and a place on the knee of your oldest hose where the wool has grown thin but has not yet broken through. You make a mental note to reinforce that knee in the next few days, when you next sit down to mend, and you put the basket away again. The mended cloak hangs on its peg, whole and strong, and the mended wall stands solid against the north wind, its patches now dried to a pale grey that matches the old plaster so closely you can barely see where you worked. The day stretches on, a long, quiet expanse of grey light and silence, and you move through it without urgency. You eat a bowl of the cold stew from last night, not bothering to warm it, and the flavours have deepened overnight, the pork and the peas and the herbs melding into something richer than they were before. You drink a cup of water and eat a dried apple ring, chewing it slowly, the sweetness faint but pleasant on your tongue. You sit on the stool by the fire and watch the flames, and you think about the winter that has passed so far, and the winter that remains, the weeks of cold and darkness that still lie ahead before the first thaw. The thought does not trouble you, because you've lived through many winters, and you know that each one ends in its own time, that the days are already lengthening beyond your notice, that the sun is already climbing a little higher each noon. You have seen the small signs, the way the light through the shutter comes a few moments earlier than it did a week ago, the way the ice on the water bucket is a little thinner in the mornings, the way the birds that vanished in the autumn will soon begin to return, first a single crow, and then a pair of finches, and then the whole chorus of spring. These things will happen whether you watch for them or not, and so you do not watch, you simply wait, and the waiting is not a hardship, but a kind of rest. In the afternoon you step outside again, wrapping the mended cloak around you, and walking a slow circle around the cottage. The snow has crusted hard, and your boots barely break through the surface, leaving only shallow impressions that fill with light rather than shadow. You walk to the edge of what will be your garden when the thaw comes, now a smooth white blankness marked only by the tops of the bean poles poking through like thin brown fingers, and you stand there looking at the sky. The pale sun is still trying to break through the clouds, and a patch of blue has opened in the west, a soft pale blue that is almost the color of a duck egg. It is the first blue sky you have seen in many days, and you look at it for a long moment, letting your eyes rest on the color, before the clouds close over it again and the world returns to grey. You go back inside and add a log to the fire and settle into the long quiet of the evening. The rushlight you light is one of the new ones, and it burns steadily in its holder, its small flame a companion to the larger flames of the hearth. You take up the drop spindle and spin a little, not because you need the thread, but because the motion is soothing, the twist of the wool and the turn of the wall a slow dance that your hands know by heart. You card a little wool and you eat another bowl of stew, and you sit and listen to the silence, a silence so deep you can hear the tiny settling of the embers and the soft rustle of the straw on the floor and the distant, almost imagined sound of water dripping somewhere far away, a sound that might be the first melt or might be only wish. The fire burns low and you let it, because the night is not as cold as it has been and the blankets are thick and warm. You undress and slide into the bed platform, pulling the wool up to your chin, and you lie still in the darkness, listening to the last sounds of the cottage settling around you. The walls that you mended stand firm, the grain that you ground waits in its bowl, the sheep that you tended rest in their straw, and the stew that you made will feed you tomorrow and the day after. Everything that needed to be done has been done, and everything that will need to be done can wait. You close your eyes and feel the deep stillness of the winter night, a stillness that is not empty but full, not lonely but peaceful, and you let it carry you gently into sleep, knowing that the days are lengthening and the cold will pass, and spring will come as it always has, as it always will, as certain and as quiet as the falling of snow,